All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to be tackling some really heavy stuff today.
Oh, yeah.
The possibility of war with Iran
Right.
and this new coronavirus threat that's emerging. We're using this article called "A War and Pestilence" as our guide. And we're going way deeper than just those headlines you see everywhere. I promise you that.
Oh, for sure.
For this first part, we're going to be focusing just on Iran.
Okay.
You've probably seen it on the news.
Sure.
We're going beyond that, though. We're looking at those things that they don't usually tell you, the
Right.
stuff that's sort of hidden beneath the surface.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this is that the author, they're living in Canada
Right.
and they're of draft age.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
immediately, this global situation becomes personal.
Oh, wow.
It's not some far-off conflict. It's something that could directly impact their life,
Yeah.
their future.
Makes you realize.
Yeah, it really raises the stakes.
It could happen to me. I mean, how many people are out there thinking it's all happening over there?
Exactly. It highlights this point, whether we realize it or not, our individual lives are tied to global events.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at the timeline, too, this was written in October 2024, but the author talks about these events from the previous month that really sparked this fear of war.
Okay.
So this would have been September, right, when tensions with Iran were escalating. We saw troop movements,
Right.
aggressive rhetoric. It really felt like things could spiral.
Yeah, and the author acknowledges that Iran's not exactly blameless.
Right.
They talk about, all this hostile rhetoric towards the U.S. and Israel,
Yeah.
which, even if you aren't a fan of those countries, you could see that as grounds for war.
Right, yeah.
But then they bring up this point about, how hypocritical is it to call Iran the biggest sponsor of terrorism
Oh, yeah.
when Saudi Arabia, a close U.S. ally, has funded groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS? Makes you wonder who gets labeled the bad guy,
Sure. It challenges that simple narrative. Iran equals evil.
Mm.
I mean, these situations are complex. You have shades of gray, competing interests, alliances that change.
Yeah.
The author even mentions how some Iran-backed groups actually fought against ISIS
Wow.
and protected Christians
Okay.
in the region.
Yeah, that really throws a wrench in things. And speaking of complex relationships, the author dives into the Israeli angle,
Okay.
suggesting that Israel, specifically Netanyahu and the Jewish lobby, they actually benefit from a weakened Iran.
Uh-oh.
And then they use the U.S. to achieve that goal. They even bring up the idea of a greater Israel,
Okay.
where they're aiming to expand Israeli territory, and how weakening Iran plays into that. It's definitely controversial.
It is. And it makes you think about lobbyists
Yeah.
and their influence
Right.
on foreign policy. Whether you agree or not, it raises the question, who's pushing for war and why? Who gains from it?
Right.
And then, of course, you got Trump.
Trump. Ah, yes. This was written in 2024. So
Right.
Trump's still in office, facing all this scrutiny.
Right, exactly. The author's a Trump supporter. They acknowledge his perceived strengths,
Okay.
but also points out these contradictions,
Uh-huh.
like attending an anti-abortion rally while heading a pro-LGBTQ administration.
Yeah, Trump was complicated. He appealed to those conservative voters, but also those unconventional voters.
Right.
It led to a lot of debate about what he was really after. And that brings us to this idea of war as a political tool.
Oh, yeah.
The author suggests that conflict can be a way to distract from domestic problems
Right.
and rally support when a presidency is struggling.
Oh, for sure.
They even connect it to those impeachment hearings that Trump was dealing with.
It's a cynical take, but not a new one.
Right.
Leaders have used war to consolidate power for centuries
Uh-huh.
or deflect attention from problems at home. It's a recurring theme.
Right.
Look at the Falklands War, for example.
Okay.
Thatcher's approval ratings were down. The economy was rough.
Right.
Boom. Conflict over these islands thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
It brought the nation together.
Yeah.
Shifted the focus.
Right.
And it ultimately helped her politically.
Wow. It makes you wonder if those in power are ever really acting for the people's benefit,
Right.
or if it's all just a calculated game.
Yeah. And speaking of calculated moves,
Mm-hmm.
we can't forget the Soleimani assassination.
Right.
The author believes this was unnecessary
Okay.
escalation. They even say they knew about Soleimani before his death.
Right.
And they saw him as just a general doing his job.
It's so easy to demonize entire countries or their leaders.
Right.
But we have to remember that real people are making these decisions.
Exactly. The author is really urging us to see the individuals,
Right.
even on the other side.
Yeah.
But the fact is, Iran's top general was killed.
Right.
What happened next?
So the author argues that Iran had to respond forcefully, right?
Right.
To maintain their image, their legitimacy.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the eyes of their own people.
They had to save face.
Right. They explain that these authoritarian regimes, they're especially sensitive to any sign of weakness
Oh, yeah.
because it could lead to uh, dissent, even revolution.
It emboldens their opponents.
Yeah.
It gives them an opening.
Right. So they're trapped. Right. They need to look strong, even if it means escalating a conflict they don't really want.
That's the point, yeah. You think about the pressures these leaders face,
Yeah.
especially in authoritarian systems.
Right.
It's not always about aggression. Sometimes it's about reacting to the system.
Okay, but how did Iran respond?
Right.
We know they launched missiles at that American base in Iraq.
Right. And it seems like a major escalation at first.
Right.
But the author points out no Americans were killed.
Okay.
And Iran was clear. This was their only planned response.
So it was more about saving face.
Exactly. Showing their people they're not backing down.
Right.
But also avoiding further provocation.
It's almost like a choreographed dance.
Yeah, and this plays right into the author's suspicion
Okay.
that this whole thing was more about appearances than actual conflict.
Oh, wow.
They even point out both sides seemed content with the outcome,
Okay.
almost like it was planned.
But then there was that horrible incident with the Ukrainian airliner
Right.
where Iran admitted they shot it down by accident.
Right.
They mistook it for a military aircraft.
That adds a whole other layer, doesn't it?
It does.
It shows how quickly things can get out of hand.
Yeah.
Even when no one wants a war.
Yeah.
A mistake, amplified by these tensions,
Right.
leads to innocent lives lost.
It really highlights how high the stakes are, even in these seemingly orchestrated situations.
Yeah. The potential for things to go wrong is always there.
Right.
And it underscores the author's main point. State actors, regardless of their ideology or goals, are operating in this world of hidden agendas,
Right.
strategic maneuvering.
The author says, and I'm quoting directly here, there would seem to be no transparency in politics. It is a game. Actions are taken to promote hidden agendas, which those acted upon are aware of and thus respond in accordance to the established narratives.
It's a cynical view, but one that many people share.
Right.
That we're not getting the whole story, that there's this deeper game.
Right. And the author seems to distrust all governments, even those they might support.
Okay.
They mention Russia specifically, how their true motives are often hidden.
Interesting.
There's this underlying skepticism of authority.
This distrust of state actors is consistent.
Yeah.
The author sees governments as inherently self-serving,
Right.
more concerned with power than their citizens.
They make this powerful statement. We are subjects of the state, just as serfs were subject to their lords.
Wow, it's a striking comparison.
It is.
And it speaks to this feeling of powerlessness that many people feel,
Right.
that we're not in control,
Yeah.
at the mercy of forces we don't understand.
So if we can't fully trust governments, if it's all an act, what does that mean for us? Where does that leave us?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
It's the million-dollar question, and it's one the author doesn't really answer.
Right.
They acknowledge the possibility of war,
Uh-huh.
not just with Iran, but as this inevitable part of human history.
Right.
They even tie this to their religious beliefs,
Yeah.
talking about those biblical prophecies about war and end times.
It's interesting because they also talk about how we've already survived so many supposed end-of-the-world situations.
Right.
Every generation thinks they're living in the most precarious time, you know?
Yeah, fears of global catastrophe, they're not new.
Right.
Every generation has its own challenges.
Right.
What's fascinating is how those anxieties manifest.
Yeah.
How they're used to manipulate public opinion or to justify certain actions.
Speaking of manipulation, the author seems to believe this whole escalation with Iran was, carefully crafted.
Right.
Designed to create the appearance of conflict, but ultimately changing nothing.
It's a bold claim. And it's worth noting that the author compares this to that conspiracy theory about the CIA secretly controlling North Korea,
Oh, wow.
which shows their distrust of these official narratives, right? They seem to think there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
It's like they're saying everything is staged,
Right.
a performance.
Yeah.
But if that's true, what's the point? Why go through all the trouble?
Well, the author suggests that both Iran and North Korea, they use these displays of aggression, these threats, to kind of bolster their internal legitimacy
Okay.
and as a way to negotiate on the international stage.
So it's all an act, a way to hold on to power, get what they want, without actually risking a war.
That's what the author's implying, yeah.
Wow.
They even bring up Kim Jong-un's use of those missile tests, right? And not as actual threats, but like bargaining chips.
Okay.
It makes you wonder how much of what we see on the news is genuine
Right.
and how much is just, political theater.
It's a disturbing thought, but it makes sense. If you look back at history, there are tons of examples of leaders using propaganda and fear.
Absolutely. Think about the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Right.
That led to Vietnam. Or those WMD claims that were used to justify invading Iraq.
Right. Right.
We've seen it all before.
So we're back to needing to think critically, question the narratives we're given, and try to find the truth in all of this.
It's hard, though, isn't it?
It is.
It takes real effort to seek out diverse perspectives, to be open to alternative explanations,
Right.
to challenge your own assumptions.
Okay, but let's go back to Iran. Even if we accept this idea that the conflict was, partly staged,
Yeah.
there were still real consequences. People died, including civilians.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole thing so tough to talk about.
Right.
Even if we acknowledge the possibility of manipulation, we can't ignore the human cost.
The author seems to struggle with this too. They talk about the tragedy of that Ukrainian airliner being shot down, but then they pivot to this argument about how all governments are untrustworthy.
I think that pivot is important.
Okay.
It reveals the author's worldview, their skepticism, and it asks this big question. If we can't fully trust the information we're given, how do we form our own opinions?
It's a huge question. I'm not sure I know the answer.
Neither.
Yeah.
But maybe the first step is just acknowledging that we are being manipulated,
Right.
that we're not getting the whole story.
Awareness is key.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once you realize that information can be a weapon, a tool to shape your perceptions, then you can start thinking critically. You
Right.
can start making more informed decisions.
And maybe that's part of the author's point. They don't offer any easy solutions, but they do want us to stay informed,
Right.
to question what we're told, and to not be overcome by fear.
Yeah, they're encouraging a kind of informed skepticism,
Okay.
acknowledging that the world is complex
Right.
and that those in power have their own agendas.
So what does this mean for us? If governments are often untrustworthy, if information's being twisted, where do we go from here?
That's a question we'll keep coming back to. But I think one takeaway is the importance of developing what we might call information literacy.
Information literacy.
Yeah, the ability to sift through the noise,
Mm-hmm.
identify bias, weigh perspectives, and reach your own conclusions.
It's like we need to become detectives,
Exactly.
constantly questioning,
Right.
verifying,
Yeah.
piecing things together.
It takes a healthy skepticism,
Okay.
but also a willingness to engage with different viewpoints, to be open to changing your mind.
It sounds exhausting.
It is.
But I guess the alternative is just blindly accepting whatever we're told.
Right, which isn't a great option.
No, it's not.
It's challenging, but it's worth it.
Right.
Because our ability to think critically, make good decisions, it's essential,
Right.
not just for us as individuals, but for society.
Okay, so we've talked about the possibility of war with Iran, the distrust of governments, and this need for information literacy.
Right.
But the author doesn't just focus on war.
No.
They bring up another threat, the Chinese coronavirus.
This transition is interesting
Yeah.
because it shows how interconnected everything is, how one crisis leads to another.
Right.
We go from the threat of war to a pandemic.
Yeah.
It's the author's view that we're living in constant uncertainty.
It's like a 1-2 punch. We're already dealing with these tensions, and now this new invisible enemy appears. It's kind of bleak, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
But the author, even with all their anxieties, doesn't want us to despair.
Okay.
They encourage us to live our lives, not to be consumed by fear,
Right.
but to stay informed, to question, to seek the truth.
It's a powerful message, and it gets to the core of what we're trying to do here.
Absolutely.
Encourage critical thinking, explore different sides of an issue, empower you, the listener, to figure things out in a world where information is often confusing, misleading.
It's about finding those hidden truths.
It's almost like the author's saying, hey, things might seem bad right now, but don't let that stop you from living. Keep learning, keep questioning.
Right. And it all goes back to that idea. We are subjects of the state. Just as serfs we're subject to their lords.
Right.
It's like, wake up,
Yeah.
recognize the power dynamics at play.
Right.
We're not just pawns in the game. We can make choices.
This whole deep dive into war with Iran, it's turned into something bigger, hasn't it?
It has.
It's about challenging authority, questioning the stories we're told,
Absolutely.
reclaiming control in a world that feels so chaotic.
It's about cultivating that information literacy.
Right, that ability to filter through all the noise,
Yeah.
see the biases,
Mm.
weigh the different perspectives.
And ultimately come to your own conclusions based on the evidence.
Yeah, it's not easy though, is it?
It's not.
We're bombarded with information constantly,
We are.
especially when so much of it is designed to mislead us.
Exactly. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But one we can't shy away from
Right.
if we want to make informed choices for ourselves and for society.
So where do we start? How do we even build up this information literacy?
That's the question, isn't it? It's something we can definitely explore more in future deep dives. But for now, I'll just say this. Be curious.
Mm.
Be skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
And be open to changing your mind.
I love that. Curiosity, skepticism, and an open mind. Those are like the essential tools for navigating this world of information overload.
Remember, the truth is rarely black and white.
Right.
It's often hidden in those subtle details, the stuff that's overlooked in those flashy headlines.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Of War and Pestilence, I just want to encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, keep looking for those hidden truths.
Yeah.
And remember what the author said, don't let fear control you.
Right.
Keep living, keep learning, keep engaging with the world, even when it feels uncertain.
Because it's in those moments of uncertainty, when we're questioning, when we're doubtful, that's when we often find the most profound truths.
That's a great point.
And it's through that process, that searching, that questioning, that wrestling with these complex ideas that we grow.
Absolutely. Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more explorations into the fascinating and sometimes, unsettling truths that shape our world.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, stay curious and keep diving.